Okay, so first I want to introduce our guest today. Reverend Dr. Ignacio Castañeda is a renowned social justice activist, retired United Methodist minister, and one of the consulting ministers at the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles, where I met Ignacio. He was born and raised in Puebla, Mexico, coming to the U.S. to attend California State University at Long Beach. He later earned both a master's and doctorate at Claremont School of Theology. Ignacio served congregations in Mexico, Hawaii, and California, including 11 years at the Hollywood United Methodist Church. He was also the first Mexican American to serve as a district superintendent in Los Angeles. He is editor of Dreams on Fire, Embers of Hope from the Pulpits of Los Angeles After the Riots, which was one of the top 10 religious books of 1992. Ignacio served as national chaplain for Planned Parenthood for 6 years and later on the board of directors and Southern California Advisory Board for the nation's leading end-of-life choice organization, Compassion and Choices. Welcome to the podcast, Ignacio.
It's great to be here.
So, for the listener, to give you a little context, actually, Ignacio and I recorded an episode last week. It went really well, but unfortunately, we had some technical difficulties. So, we're kind of taking another stab at it. And this is actually going to be part one of an ongoing dialogue here. So, Ignacio, I wanted to first ask you about the impact that your mother had on your spirituality when you were a kid.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Mexico and I was born in a very small town. It's now bigger, but when I was born, I don't think there were 10,000 people in the town. And my mother was extremely active in the Catholic Church. So I was baptized in the Catholic Church. My parents were married in the Catholic Church. My mother was very, very active in the church. But when my second brother came, my mother was pregnant with him. She urged my dad to seek for jobs and look for jobs in the bigger city in Puebla. And so we went to live over there. And my earliest recollection is from the city of Puebla. And many of those early recollections involved religious activities, going to mass, praying the rosary at home, reading the catechism. And she was really, guiding us. And she was able to get us into a parochial school for a few years. Later on, I don't know what happened, but whatever scholarship we had didn't come through for later on, and that caused interesting problems in my growing up. But my mom was very, very devout. But the interesting thing for me is the way in which the home theology and the church theology began to clash a little bit, because on the one hand, my mom being a traditionalist, she would use the language of the church, God being omnipotent. And yet when it was time to administer punishment, which she did, not cruel, but it hurt. And she would say to us, palo dado ni Dios lo quita, meaning a beating, not even God can take it away. And so that, where is this almighty God that cannot help me now with this beating?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that she introduced very early the doubts, in a sense, of which is which, Interestingly enough, she also was a very good ethicist in a way. I mean, many, many years later, I came up with, I encountered something called situational ethics. And situational ethics, rather than having fixed rules and regulations, the actual situation in which one finds oneself help determine what the appropriate behavior is for that particular moment. And my mom had a saying for us. she would say, I'll say it quickly in Spanish, and she would say, en la calle como reyes, en la iglesia como santos, en su casa como locos. So in the streets, walk around royally. Mm. In church, be like a saint. At home, you can be crazy if you want. En su casa como locos. And so that was a very important early teaching, you know, that helped me realize that situations were more important than rules and regulations. Mm-hmm. Now, she didn't actually sit down and say rules are not important, you know, right. But just the way she behaved, you know, the way she taught, I think was far more important in a way, you know. And, right. And I actually really did like many of the parts of the Catholic Church, especially what people call the scents, the sights, and the sounds of that religion, you know. So yeah, I don't have any bad feelings. I have changed. I did not remain Catholic all my life, but a part of me is always Catholic, you know. It's right. Yeah.
That's beautiful. The situational ethics reminds me, you know, I mean, it reminds me of Jesus's teachings in a lot of ways, you know. Exactly. One example is like working on the Sabbath or doing, you know, performing miracles on the Sabbath, and right. Just this emphasis on the direct situation at hand rather than a code of laws. That always struck me as kind of what Jesus was highlighting in a lot of ways.
Right. Yeah.
And even the Holy Spirit seems to be related to that.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I remember you telling a little story about, I can't remember how old you were, but pretty young, when I think that you were go around the church or walking into the church or something, and you had a kind of an epiphany about maybe the vulnerability of time and the connection that you had with the people around you. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, this was on a New Year's Eve. It was our custom to go to the midnight mass. So we would start the year in church, and we usually would go to the town where I was born and then would walk from my grandparents' home to the church. And just as we were entering into the courtyard of the church, I was with my grandmother and my mother. Others were walking ahead or behind us, but the bells of the church began tolling midnight. And something at that moment just made me very much aware of the fragility of life, of the passing of time, of the fact that this grandmother that was next to me, you know, and was so much older and weaker and all of that, might not be too many more years, and also my own lifetime, you know, what would it be? But I was not quite 11 yet. I think I was just 10 years old at the time, but I remember very clearly. It wasn't scary, but it was just kind of added a weight to that moment that has stayed with me all my life. And it's
a heightened sensitivity.
There's a kind of a transition. Yeah, there's that.
Yeah, that's nice. I've had moments like that too. Just a heightened sensitivity is the way that I feel. And that can happen in so many different ways, you know. I mean, sometimes, most recently, I was watching a movie actually, and it put me in that state of mind. And afterwards, there was this lingering feeling where, you know, I was just staring at my dog, just thinking how, like you said, kind of the tenderness or the fragility of life itself. And so when you told me that story, that stuck out to me. So that was around a few years before, if I remember correctly. It was when you were 13 when you transitioned from
Right,
Catholicism to
right.
Methodism. Can you say
Yes.
anything about the
Well,
transition there?
I kiddingly refer to that as my personal bar mitzvah, because I was
Right.
13. And there were some things that were happening already that were um, sort of putting bigger and bigger questions for me and creating a gap between the teachings of the church and my personal faith. And I was supposed to go to the Jesuit high school, since the founder of the Jesuits was Ignacio, also Ignacio de Loyola, and so uh, also to please my mom, I think I read in Ernesto Cardenal's biography that all of the boys promised their mothers that they would become priests, but of course, as the hormones kick in and perhaps similar kinds of situations like I encounter, then the numbers drop off, and very few of those promises are fulfilled. And in fact, that's true even today. I mean, the Catholic Church is finding it very difficult to recruit priests these days. So.
Mm-hmm.
And here in the United States, a great number of the priests are actually from the third world rather than from the United States. So I think that, in a sense, I was beginning to sense that which eventually became a crisis within the church. So perhaps the most important question that arose in my head had to do with the role of the family, and even though I didn't quite understand all of the issues about sexuality, the hormones begin to kick in, and you
Mm-hmm.
begin to look at the girls or at,
Right.
and then you go celibacy, all of this kind of thing. And then there was a gentleman in the apartment house that would come furtively. I remember his fedora, and he would come in, and supposedly he was the uncle of one of our friends that lived in the place there, and unbeknownst to me, my mom and all of the ladies in the apartment knew that this gentleman actually was a priest. And we did not go to the parish where he was a priest normally, but on one particular Sunday we ended up at the parish, and I always liked to go to the very front. I had been an altar boy, and in those days the mass was in Latin, and I knew all of the responses in Latin and all of that. And so I went to the front, and my friends went with me. And in those days, the priest would face the altar, not the people, and only would from time to time would turn around and face the congregation, say a few things, hear the responses, and again turn to the altar. That changed completely after Vatican II, by the way, as well as the fact that Latin is no longer the enforced language of the ritual of the church. So when he turned around, I mean, everybody that was next to me, they began elbowing each other, and they said, "That is Luis's dad," and so I just said, "No, I don't think so." But I already kind of suspected that when I saw him. And so when the mass ended, the priest is supposed to lead in a group of 5 or 6 shorter prayers. And so everybody leaves. Some people do stay and engage in that in those prayers. But I went through the sacristy because having been an acolyte, it's pretty much the same in every church. And then I went out through the sacristy to the back street, and there was the car that this gentleman used to drive. And it was a major shock. And so we talked about it on the way home. And my brother, as soon as we came in, he started yelling at the top of his lungs, "Guess who was saying Mass, Mom?" And my mom came out and pulled him in, because, as I told you, she already knew. And many years later, she told us that she had told my uncle, who was the canon at the cathedral, she had told him about what was happening. And my uncle basically said, "Don't judge, don't judge the priest." And my mother said, I'm not judging. I'm just worried about the faith of my own children. And when that finally did happen, my mom went back to see her cousin, first cousin. And then at that time, they relocated this priest to another village very far away from there, which of course then separated him from his family. And so the whole issue about family, I mean, the issue of sexuality did not enter so much in my thinking, but the issue that someone was separated from his family, was removed. And the church preached a lot about the family and all of that. And here they take it. So my uncle and I went through a lot of conversations. And finally, I said, I don't think I'm going to go. I don't want to go into the priesthood. And he said, well, celibacy is a gift. It's a charisma. He said, he used the word in the Greek word. That's so you don't have it. That's fine, But so he was very angry that had happened. And then a week after my 13th birthday, I was invited to a Halloween party to the Methodist Church. Catholics do not have, or did not have in those days, Halloween parties. So I didn't even know what it was, but I was invited. I didn't think my mom would let me go, but she did. And she really liked this young woman that invited me. She was the same age that I was. And so she was the one who went and asked my mom, can he go, to the party? And she made me promise I wouldn't go in the sanctuary or anything like that. And I said, sure. So, but I actually went with some trepidation because I had heard some very bad things about Protestants, the nuns, the people who taught us catechism. We would cross the street when we would go in front of one of the Protestant temples. There were not those many. So, but we would go across, And so when I went there, I found a very healthy and fun environment, and people were very friendly. And towards the end of the evening, one of the guys, same age as I was, asked me if I knew Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior. My first reaction was like, what is this Protestant asking me, But I actually thought about his question, and it was the word personal that got me, because in those days, the Catholic Church really had too many intermediates between the believer and the person of Jesus. So I said, well, tell me more. So he did mention a few more things, and it sounded so nice. Here I had learned catechism and I knew, the basic teachings of the Catholic Church, but this guy seemed to really have a different source of knowledge, and I got interested, and I asked him, where did he get all of that? And he said, well, in Sunday school. And so I said, I want to come. So I went home and I announced to my mother's horror that I wanted to go to the Methodist Church the next day.
Yeah.
But my father supported me. My father played a different role in my religious awareness. He really was a very strong believer in the presence of God in his life, but he did not like the Catholic Church. He later on, to his credit, he never shared any of those things with us. But when we all became Methodist, then he shared some of the stories that had led him farther and farther away from the Catholic Church. And so he really responded very easily to my request to accompany me to the Christmas service that 2 months later.
Yeah.
And when we came out of there, says, this is what I've been looking for so many years. And so my dad, became a more devout attender of the church. He had his personal rituals. He had a special devotion for the Virgin of Guadalupe. And he later on, he told us lots of stories. I was really blessed that my dad lived to be 90, and he spent a lot of time with us here in the States, after after his retirement, and so I got a lot of the early history, his early history.
Interesting.
And
cool.
yeah, and so it was a different kind, but so it gave me a very balanced, I think, upbringing in terms of my perspective of religion.
Yeah, and then you, your parents both impacted you, of course, but then you ended up influencing them. And it's pretty amazing that even though your mom was kind of in horror, as you say at first, she ended up attending the Methodist Church as well, right?
Oh, 4 years later. 4 years later, there was a week of evangelism with a priest who had left the Catholic Church, a Peruvian guy. And so my mom and dad went to all of the services that week in the evenings. And at the end of that week, my mom made her decision. I think it had something to do with the style of preaching of this priest. I can't remember his name. But from that moment on, she really became very, very much involved and remained that way until the end of her life. So, yeah. So, yeah.
Another thing I wanted to get into this related to all of this is you mentioned how to you viewing Jesus as fully human makes a lot more sense to you. Can you say whether you always felt that way, or and why is it that is your, that's kind of the cornerstone of your perception of Jesus?
Right. Well, obviously, when I was much younger and in the Catholic Church, as I told you, I mean, Jesus was very separated from us.
Right.
Then when I became a Methodist and began reading the Bible directly, then I began discovering more of this very, very human, very real, very well connected with God, but by no means himself divine. And actually, the Bible doesn't say that Jesus is God. It says that God was in Christ, but it's in the same way in which God is in each and every one of us, perhaps in various proportions, and perhaps the way in which we focus on the idea of God and ask for God's guidance. I think Jesus was intimately connected with his perception of who God was, but he was profoundly human. And somewhere in my early 20s, that solidified very strongly that for me, Jesus, the Protestant theologians make a distinction between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And to me, the Jesus of history is a lot more interesting than the Christ of faith. But I understand why they do that and why it helps them in some of the things they're trying to do. But for me, it makes much more sense to relate to this very, very real human being that then gives me the opportunity to imitate as best as I can, what he was doing. If indeed he's God, then forget it.
Right.
That game is lost from the very beginning, and so
yeah. Well,
yeah.
Can you there was, I think you last conversation you referenced a certain line in the New Testament that highlights the humanness of Jesus, and I would like for you to address that, as well as what you just said about seeing Jesus as kind of, more of a role model, I guess,
Right.
And how your faith led you to social justice.
Right. Well, it's a story that gives many preachers a lot of difficulty because it's Jesus at his most human. And many of them try to give a pass to Jesus. I'll tell you the story. The story is that Jesus is basically on R&R in the region of Tyre and Sidon, which are in the northern and western part of where Jesus' ministry took place. So it was R&R, and he was surrounded by people who were not Jewish and from Israel, Palestine. So he's relaxing, and then this woman comes over and says, my daughter is hurting, help me. And in one of the versions, the disciples tell Jesus, tell her to go away. And in another one, there's just this dialogue between Jesus and the woman. And so she's also described as being Syrophoenician. So it's very clear she's not of the same ethnic background of Jesus. So Jesus tells her, I was sent to the people of Israel. It's not fair for me to give to the dogs that which belongs to the children. And the Syrophoenician woman responds, yes, Lord, but even the dogs get to eat the crumbs that fall from the table of the children. And that woke him up, that reminded him that he really had not come just to a little ethnic group, but that the love that he was talking about to the people in Israel indeed was meant for everybody. And he then says, it's true that your faith is really strong, and your daughter is already healed. When you get home, she'll be fine. Mm-hmm. So I like the fact that it was a knee-jerk reaction on the part of Jesus. And many of the pastors and preachers, many of the people who have written about this, give Jesus a pass and say, well, he was just testing her, see how faithful she was. Well, that just takes away again, because they start with this semi-divine or fully divine Jesus that couldn't make any mistakes and couldn't be too human. That's why they have to go in that direction. I don't go in that direction, because I start with the assumption that he's like any one of us, that at any time when we are not at our best, we can really make a mistake and say some horrible things,
Right.
And I recently heard of a pastor say, I don't think calling a person a dog is really an insult, because he loves dogs very much. And so it's interesting how we try to make the pieces fit according to what we really feel.
For sure. Yeah. So I am interested in how your faith impacts your your work for social justice for decades. How do those two relate to each other for you?
Well, I was very much blessed by the time in which I finally made the decision to really go into the ministry, because at that time the civil rights movement was going on, and the bulk of the leadership of the civil rights movement was made up of people who were believers. Martin Luther King was a pastor. His father was a pastor. And so for them, the Bible was not just a book about, God in the sky and all of that. It was about, a God who cared for all, and who cared for Blacks in particular also, so that they wouldn't have to be mistreated the way they were being mistreated. I also had other professors in my life, one of them being John Cobb, who actually was arrested for demonstrated against the Vietnam War. He was in Washington, D.C. And so everything just kind of kept on adding to my original feelings, and just heightening more and more and more the conviction that if I was going to be involved in the in religious life, it had to be a religion that is addressing the pain and the concerns of real human beings. So that's what happened. And then, of course, later on, I met Cesar Chavez. He was Roman Catholic, but his faith was the one that also was impelling him and compelling him to do that. And so the Congressman Lewis, also he was part of that movement. He was not. They used to call him the little preacher also. So the faith and the Bible were very important for him also. Yeah. So it was coming together of all kinds of things, my own personal perspective, what was happening in the nation specifically at that time. So it just was inevitable that I would always ask myself, again, following my mom's advice, what's the situation in which I find myself? You know, and what does my faith say about this situation? You know, that's why when the gay issue came up, also the same thing. You know, what is my faith? What does it say? How do I respond to this?
So I know that you've been involved in Los Angeles with interfaith dialogue and I, if I remember correctly, I think it was at one of those events that you ended up meeting Keola and then trying out the First Unitarian Church, perhaps. Right. So, can you say anything about your experience working with like interfaith initiatives and stuff like that?
Yeah, you know, the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, that was already interfaith. You know, I mean, you look at the photographs or videos of many of the marches, and you'll see rabbis, you'll see people with kippas, you see priests with, you know, and there were many Unitarians also involved in all of those movements. You know, so it was very clear. So that was already the same thing with the anti-war movement. When I went to Hawaii and served over there, and I was 5 miles away from the entrance of the Kaneohe Marine Corps base, you know, and we used to go and demonstrate. Who was there? But, you know, the Unitarian pastor, the rabbi, several of the pastors of other churches, a few Roman Catholics. So that it was not interfaith dialogue in the abstract. It was in light of the issues that were confronting us. Later on, I was able also to join what was called the Faith and Order Commission of the National Council of Churches, which brought together people of different denominations and different perspectives, but primarily Christian. And then later on, I was part of the ecumenical movement as well. 9/11 pushed us in Los Angeles to become far more interfaith, because our main concern at the time was that there were going to be a lot of vindictive actions against Muslims. And we knew many Muslims. And so the Friday after the towers fell, we had a meeting at the Baptist church that's across the street, actually, basically across the street from the Unitarian Church. And there we created an organization which still exists to this moment, and it's called Interfaith Communities United for Justice and Peace. And that brought together and continues to bring together a lot of very committed people that are active in society because of their faith perspective. So that just has been my way of doing always the same things, you know. So the situation with Keola had to do with an event at a sponsored by Sunrise, which is the group that helped create the Green New Deal. And I took John Cobb to that meeting, and so one of the activities was to get to know your neighbors to your right and to your left, and so Keola was actually sitting to my left, and then his immediate response when I asked him, "Why are you here?" is because I belong to a very progressive church. I go, well, what church would that be? And he said, Unitarian Church. And it was a surprise to me, because this is no secret to you, the church was actually losing a lot of members and was going down. And, you know, there were questions as to whether or not it would survive. So I said, my goodness, the next Sunday I was there, you know, I went to see the miracle, you know, that all of you have been able to put together over there, you know. So.
Yeah. So you had already, you know, worked with some Unitarians a little bit, and I'm sure you had an understanding of Unitarianism. And so were you ever, did you say that you had spoken at the church in previous years as well?
I had been in conversations with several of previous pastors, and when I did that book that you mentioned, the Dreams on Fire, Embers of
Mm-hmm.
Hope, actually I included the wonderful sermon that the pastor at the Church of Woman preached. My work, basically, the heaviest part of my work was to call people and find out what they had preached about. And she had a wonderful sermon. So, and I have statements from in that book from people from all over the religious landscape, you know. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and so I had been in touch with Unitarian Church of Los Angeles for a long time. You know, I had like having been there 11 years at the church in Hollywood, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, you know who's who are
Sure.
the pastors and all in some of the other churches. So,
Sure.
but as I told you, I was concerned because I knew that the membership was waning, and
Yeah.
it wasn't what it was once. But now I think it's really doing very well. Now there's an edge, I think, and I'm on that edge of Methodism that is very Unitarian. And Rebecca Parker, who was the first woman president of the seminary,
Mm-hmm.
she holds credentials in both the Methodist Church and the Unitarian Church.
She's
And,
great. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and she was the president of Star King Seminary.
Mm-hmm.
And John Cobb has addressed the National Unitarian Gathering at least one time, I know that. So many Unitarian pastors have read Cobb and find them very,
Sure.
very Unitarian.
Sure. Yeah.
John does not feel that the Trinity is important. It's not whether or not he believes or not believe. It's not important because it is the whole issue of the Trinity in ancient Christianity. That term, which does not appear in the Bible, comes
Mm-hmm.
up because of the impending divinization of Jesus. You know, as Jesus was becoming less and less human and more divine, then the questions begin to appear. But what is the relationship between the God the Father, God the Son, and then this other third person, the Trinity? You know, and but it was a brave attempt, a courageous attempt on the part of the teachers at that time to retain monotheism.
Mm-hmm.
But unfortunately, they blew it because people, I mean, even well-trained seminarians don't understand. They can't defend. They can't talk about the Trinity in a congruent kind of a way.
Right. Well, it's interesting that later in your life you've found yourself as a consulting minister at the
Yes.
at the Unitarian Church. Do you
Yes.
feel pretty at home there? Do you feel like
Very
you're
much, very much so, very much. But see, the thing is that I no longer feel that I have to be tied just to one kind of a thing. You know,
Right.
Hala, my wife, is Muslim, and I find a lot of wonderful things in Islam as well. You know, Islam, by the way, was thoroughly Unitarian, you know, and Muhammad was saying this Trinity baloney, you know, just and in southern Spain, the big debates between the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians around the Trinity, you know, the Christians always lost those.
Yeah.
But Muslims and Jews, you know, have that much in common, that strong belief in monotheism, which Christians say they do have it, but then they get put in a corner by trying to say that Jesus was so divine, you know, and
right.
And all of those things, they are creedal statements that emerge out of an imperial necessity, not at all connected with the faith of Jesus, really.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. So you mentioned John Cobb a couple times, and I know next time we'll get more into process philosophy and process theology. but I thought maybe as kind of a last little chunk of our conversation today, maybe we could talk about how you first met John Cobb and the impact that he's had on you.
Right, right. Well, I think that what was also happening to me, because of all of the influences in my life in terms of my own theology, then I began to ask myself, what is it that I really believe about the nature of God?
Mm-hmm.
And as I began taking more philosophy courses and reading a little bit more, I began to learn a little bit more about this process philosophy, which also called the philosophy of organism. And in Compton College, I had a very good professor that liked Whitehead a lot. And then I also had two professors at Cal State University. I was blessed again, with the fact that I could go to college with no expense, basically $8.50 per semester.
It's amazing.
In the junior college, and $35 per semester in the state university, plus $100 for the foreign student fees. I mean, we did not need affirmative action or anything like that. Anybody who wanted to study could study. There's no way of not getting education. And on top of that, wonderful education, because all of these professors with a lot of knowledge and openness. And so that's when I began discovering a different way of talking about God. And I had always been interested in science as well. And that was beginning to squeeze me into a corner. Can I really still believe in evolution and in quantum science and quantum physics and all of that, while at the same time being a believer? I remember I bought a book, which I thought, really, this was for me. It was called Sermons for Intellectuals.
Nice.
And, for me, a reasonable faith was very important, and one that I could say, I can stand next to a person who is well educated in physics or biology or whatever, and still account for my faith and say, well, it's not God the way you grew up with, or even the way I grew up with, but there are other ways of talking about God. And one of them being that God is not omnipotent, which I learned after my mother's beatings. But it was slowly but surely replaced by this other God that is more congruent both with modern science, but also more congruent with the teachings of the prophets of Israel, that movement in which Jesus participated, and that deity is very different. It's a deity that is really not interested in power. It's more interested in love. And you can see how slowly but surely it culminates in the teachings of Jesus and the absorption of those teachings by the followers of Jesus. So that finally what starts, I think I mentioned this before, starts with these tender images in the Old Testament of a God who asks, who was it that taught Ephraim to walk? I mean, teaching a baby to walk, you're not teaching, but enabling, helping that little baby on the way to being a toddler to walk. That is a beautiful, tender image. And I was blessed in being 13 years older than my youngest brother, and 9 years older than my sister, that I was able to see them growing and taught them to walk. So when I ran across that in the Bible, I said, what a beautiful, tender image, The other one, I think I mentioned once before, is that it's a tender and frightful image, because God refers to, God says, I'm like a she-bear, I'm going to defend my cubs,
Yeah.
Well, there the might and the love kind of still are together,
Right.
But more and more and more, the might recedes and the power of love ascends. So then by the time you come to Jesus, it's so clear, when Jesus teaches, love those who are not like you. What do you do if you only love those who are like you?
Right.
Don't Pharisees love Pharisees? Don't publicans love publicans? But you have to love others. And then that incredible teaching, love your enemies, so that has to be based also on a deity that is profoundly loving and caring. And Jesus referred to that deity as Abba, as Daddy. It's too bad that in the Lord's Prayer, people went back to our Father. No, our Father could be out there. Daddy is the one that taught me to walk. Daddy is the one that told me, it's Abba. And God, by the way, wrote one of his later books was called Jesus is Abba. And talks about that personal, familial relationship between God and us. And then those that had learned that, a man named John, who wrote 3 epistles, 3 letters, he's the one who says, those who do not love know God, because God is love. So that, I think, just solidified my conviction that process thought, which respects science, emerges from science, but at the same time is extremely mindful of the tender elements of the universe. And that is very, very important to me. And it's congruent, and it feeds better my concerns in society than anything else that I have been able to find.
Right.
So that philosophy of organism, which then becomes theology, process theology, is at the center of my beliefs, especially now with the ecological problems, without ever abandoning the concern for the poor and the downtrodden, because that is also emerging in the Bible, and it's never abandoned in the Bible. And so that's maybe the teaser to say, find out how process and liberation theologies can come together and be really significant ways of continuing to serve people out of a center of religious conviction.
Yes. Wow. That's fascinating. I guess, that is a good place to end, but I wanted to just touch on, just to recap a little bit. So you took a philosophy class that introduced you to Whitehead and introduced you to process thought, and you were already, you had religious conviction ever since you were young. So that had been a big part of your life, your whole life. And you had also been drawn to the intersection between your religious faith and kind of hands-on, on the ground, real, issues, and social problems and environmental problems. So by the time that you encountered John Cobb, in some ways he was really representing a lot of things that you had already started to be drawn to. And and didn't you say that your first day was it at Claremont?
Yes, I actually did not have the luxury to shop around for seminaries. The seminary that I came to was this one here in Claremont, because that's the one that offered the scholarships at the time, and it was right here. And I had other people who had connections there and took me there. But the first day that when I arrived, John Cobb was being installed as the professor, the Ingraham Professor of Theology, and he was giving his lecture, his installation lecture, which was affirming God in a non-theistic age. And as he spoke, I realized that in a mysterious, mystical, wonderful way, I had been prepared to be at the feet of this great sage
Yeah.
That was very young at that time, and hadn't even written his first major work on process theology. That actually happened as he was teaching us. That book, Christian Natural Theology, came up. But it was so clear in the lecture that he gave, and he did quote Whitehead. It was very clear that Whitehead and Hartshorne and several other process thinkers were informing his thinking. And it was like, I think I mixed my metaphors. I am in Mecca.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And I took every course that I could take with him. And then later on, we just established a long relationship. And I'm so glad that he has lived 97 years. He just turned 97 on Wednesday, and still sharp and capable of entering into serious conversations and all of that, and guiding many of us and many newer people. That what is also so exciting, as exciting as it was to me to see how many younger people are at the Unitarian Church, it is exciting for me to see how many young people are now discovering Whitehead and are discovering John Cobb and all of that movement, which in the 20th century was kind of, we don't know where will it go? But now in the 21st century, it's just sweeping literally throughout the world, because there are centers in China, in India, in Korea, in Japan, in Latin America. So, and precisely because of that, the questions of liberation also come up. How does this highly philosophical theology, how does it actually meet with the needs of the poor in Latin America?
Right. Yes. Well, that is wonderful. And that gives a good grounding and framework for what we'll talk about next time. So, Ignacio, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and we'll do it again soon.
I'll get ready for March so that we can do something on that.
Perfect.
Liberation.
Yes. And like I said, I really could see you writing a book about this. So hopefully our conversations maybe can, feed that a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.